Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Kimball Art Museum. I think everyone here knows me. I'm George Shackelford, Deputy Director, and it's been my pleasure to organize the exhibition, Modern Art and Politics in Germany, Masterworks from the Neue Nationalgalerie Berlin, which has been on since the end of March. One of the paintings in the exhibition is this one, I think. There we go. The only painting not from the Neue Nationalgalerie Berlin is this one from the Kimball Art Museum by the German painter Lovis Corinth, born at the end of the 1850s and who died in 1925, 100 years ago. Lovis Corinth is an artist that we don't know much about these days. In 1950, Julius Held, 1950, that is to say 75 years ago, the art historian Julius Held wrote in the preface to an exhibition catalog, he said, "Corinth is still practically unknown in this country, even though some of his finest works are in American private collections, and some museums are beginning to become aware of his statue as a graphic artist. May this exhibition help to gain for Corinth his rightful place in our picture of European art. He will most surely appeal to our younger artists, and to the larger public too, will be fascinated by his vigorous and uncompromising art. Indeed, I am convinced that before long, Corinth's name will be as familiar and as meaningful to all as the names of other great European artists of his generation." Well, that didn't happen. It didn't happen at all. And when I saw this painting in Munich in the summer of 2017, I thought, well, how am I going to propose this work to the Kimball Art Museum? It's a work of extraordinarily great beauty and power. The image of the man represented is so vivid. We can look right into his eyes and see the personality sort of shining through. It's incredibly skillfully painted. Notice, for instance, the way Corinth paints the eyeglasses without you even noticing them, without you being able, you notice that they're there, but you can't tell quite how he has painted them. He uses the butt of his brush to scratch a line into the skin above the sitter's nose to indicate the bridge between the glasses of his pince-nez. His wristwatch, his ring, his ash, the smoke that lifts into the air from his cigar are incredibly beautifully painted. And this is Heinrich Tannhauser, a man whom we know more about, perhaps, than we know about Lovis Corinth these days, because his son, Justin Tannhauser, bequeathed their family's collection to the Guggenheim Museum in New York City. But we don't know much about the painter himself, Lovis Corinth. And I think that's a shame. And so tonight, I am hoping to acquaint you more with the background on this artist than you may otherwise have ever learned before. And I hope to increase your enthusiasm for Lovis Corinth, and so that you may be on the lookout for his works when you travel and as you enjoy the one that we have here at the Kimball. As Julius Held said, many works by Lovis Corinth are in American collections, and here are just a few of them. This one is at Harvard. It's a Salome from about 1900. His portrait of his father, or a study of a nude model, both from the 1880s, one at St. Louis and the other in Milwaukee. Two vigorous nudes from the collection of the St. Louis Art Museum, both from around 1910-ish. This wonderful portrait, also in Milwaukee. this great portrait of a sculptor from the museum at Harvard, and two more portraits, one from the Museum of Modern Art and the other also from Harvard. Now, Lovis Corinth, as I said, was born in the 1850s. And he, across the span of his life, here are two portraits from the 1880s and from 1924. Across the span of his life, he worked in an incredible variety of styles. And a lot of this has to do with the fact of the timing of his birth and the era in which he lived. He's born in an East Prussian city called Tapiau. It's now in Russia, in fact. And he was born there, the son of a tanner, a man who tanned leather. He wrote in his memoirs late in his life, he said, "I have been unhappy throughout my life. From the beginning, there was this secret war of my stepbrothers against me, a continuous strife and quarrel over the fact that they had received no education, whereas he had. Secretly, they even threatened to kill me. The memory of this situation from my childhood has remained with me to this day. I have always felt a certain respect toward the more privileged classes, yet my disposition did not allow me to love anyone. On the contrary, everyone considered me rather repulsive and crude on account of my ill-bred barbarity. I envy those who possessed a cheerful temperament or a greater ability than I. A burning ambition has always tormented me. There has not been a day when I did not curse my life and did not want to terminate it." Well, that's a pretty miserable statement. And in fact, it is, I think, the musings of an old man about a life that was, in fact, much more rewarding and rich than his late life musings, as I said, should indicate. He leaves Tapiau and goes to Königsberg, also in East Prussia, and it's a town where it's the coronation capital of Prussia. The kings of Prussia go there to be crowned, and he ends up there and takes the role. This is, in fact, he is in fancy dress, but he's dressed as a countryman here, and he takes up the role of an art student there. He can't learn from anybody very fancy because there aren't very many teachers in Königsberg. But he soon finds himself in Paris in the 1880s. And it's in Paris that he has his photograph taken, for instance, and joins the students at the Académie Julian. The Académie Julian was a sort of a free-flowing academy. It wasn't like the École des Beaux-Arts. You did have to pay to get your instruction there. But it was a very liberal education without so many restrictions as you found at the École des Beaux-Arts, the more officially state-sponsored art school. He studied at the Académie Julian under two teachers of great repute, William Bouguereau, who you see at the left here, and Tony Robert Fleury, who you see at the right. Here are nudes by those artists, Bouguereau at left and Robert Fleury, a later nude at the right. And it is from them that Corinth will have learned his great mastery of anatomy and drawing. He became a great painter of the female nude, as you'll see as we proceed, and it has its origins in his study with these two artists. He also, throughout his life, will return to history painting, to the painting of stories, whether biblical or historical, classical literature, etc. And you'll see a bit of this as we go along. And in this, he may have had some inspiration from Robert Fleury, a big history painting by whom I show you here. But at the same time, he managed to find his way into the exhibitions where the art of a new naturalist generation in France was being shown. And here's a painting of two haymakers that he will have seen by Bastien Lepage, an artist he much admired at this period in his life. His great ambition was to be admitted to the Salon, and he said that he was going to stay in Paris until he got a work accepted at the Salon, the annual juried exhibition held every year where literally thousands of works of art by artists from all countries would be shown together in a massive installation in Paris. The jury, you see at left, voting on a work of art. They're raising their canes and umbrellas to say yay or nay. And you see visitors to the Salon at the right. The painting that he had accepted seems to be lost now, and this is the best illustration that we have of it from a very old photograph. It was called The Conspiracy, and he managed to get it into the Salon, and then he could leave and go back to Germany. He goes back to Königsberg, where he is able to continue to practice his career as an artist. And as you see, by the 1880s, by 1887, when he's back in Königsberg, he is extremely gifted in terms of the way he can paint. He's mastered anatomy, he's mastered foreshortening, he has learned to use the brush with great aplomb, and he is able to do not only nudes and classical subjects, but also genre paintings, very much in the manner of Bastien Lepage, whom you saw just a moment ago. Leaving Königsberg for a place that had greater artistic potential for him, he moves to Munich, which, along with Paris, is considered one of the great capitals for art study at the end of the 19th century. And a capital in which not only could you learn a lot from the artists that surrounded you, but also there were plenty of people coming through Munich, and you had the chance of exhibiting and having a career there. He establishes himself in Schwabing, which was the sort of bohemian part of town, if you will, the sort of the Montmartre of Munich, where he's photographed by a friend in front of one of his nudes from around 1890 at the right. And he submits to the Munich Secession in 1893 this history painting of Diogenes, the man who goes around looking for an honest man from Greek mythology. When this painting was put on view, one critic wrote, "German art is dead. We must cry once more. The worst of the worst is Lovis Corinth, with a large-scale work in which Diogenes, half-naked and nearly life-size, lifts his lantern in search of an honest man. Is this really the new German art?" I think it's a little bit exaggerated to say that German art is dead just because of this painting. But it is very much of a type that is being practiced really all over Europe, and in which we see very little of in this country because we simply have not collected this kind of salon or official kind of art in most American museums. To compare with his Diogenes, you might see any number of other works from European masters, but you could also compare the realism with which he approaches the subject to the everyday genre subjects that he practices in Königsberg and Munich at this time, like this interior of a slaughterhouse. And this is just to show you that he, at the very beginning, is able to use a very free method of painting which you see in the sketch that he uses to develop the composition of the slaughterhouse at the left. And this is a work that is very much part of a larger tendency in German art at the period to address subjects of work. And Adolf Menzel was the great progenitor of this type of subject matter in German art. Here's his iron rolling mill from the middle of the 19th century, a work which Corinth would have seen in Berlin, where it was on view. He begins to paint in a whole variety of subject matters. He can paint a fantastic landscape, but he also begins to paint works telling historical subjects. Here, for instance, is his Deposition from 1895, a work which he bases on an old master painting that he has seen in the Alte Pinakothek in Munich, this entombment from about 1490 by an Italian master. Or he paints a big bacchanal, which he bases on Rubens's Drunken Silenus of 1616 to 17. The Torment of St. Anthony, another giant multi-figured composition involving the female nude rather. Or the larger version, I showed you the Fogg Art Museum version a moment ago. This is the version from Leipzig of his Salome from about 1900. Or this Perseus and Andromeda, a painting from, again, around 1900. He was content with the nude, but I think not happy with the way he had painted the suit of armor, which by now is a prop in his studio, and you'll see a good bit more of it as time goes on. Now, I mentioned that there are other artists practicing this kind of rather histrionic painting. You might compare Corinth to Georges Rosgros, for instance, in France, whose Night of the Flowers from 1894 is at the Musée d'Orsay. Or František Kupka in Prague and Vienna, whose Ballad or The Joys of Life is in the National Gallery in Prague from 1902. Or the craziest of them all, Jacek Malczewski, a Polish artist whose Vicious Circle from 1897 is in the museum in Poznan, and it's a really vast composition. Corinth was participating in this sort of symbolist, official art that had a kind of kooky aspect, and in spite of Rosgros, it's not typically what's going on in France. It's a kind of art that's happening more in Germany or in Austria or in the Middle European countries, Poland, Czechoslovakia, etc. And he always has in his art a slightly off-ball streak, as for instance, when in 1896 he portrays himself standing beside a skeleton, a studio implement used by many artists to further their study of anatomy and to understand the body a bit better. So he actually had a skeleton hanging in his studio and just happens to portray himself standing next to it. This kind of sort of overblown art is where he sees at this point his calling. But he decides that he perhaps had better change cities. Munich has become a little bit too parochial for him. He's had a bit of a flutter with the Munich Secession, a kind of betrayal that he had led a group of artists out of the Munich Secession and never was forgiven by the authorities again after that. And so he decides to move to Berlin, the capital of the now unified Germany, which is, of course, the biggest city and the most cosmopolitan city in this part of Europe. Indeed, I think as cosmopolitan as Vienna is. And he moves there in 1900, 1901, at the height of the German Empire, when the Kaiser Wilhelm II is very much in control of German politics as well as German culture. And there, the National Gallery, founded as the great museum of German modern art and German culture, is the great institution to which everyone should aspire. So he finds himself then around 1900 in Berlin, and he is by now in his 40s already and has yet to really establish himself on a truly national or international a stage in the way that he will just in the next coming years. He decides to open an art school. And in part, this is for the money, because he gets paid by the pupils that he takes in. And in fact, it's very much useful to him to have this extra income. What's remarkable, however, is that he decides to open a school for women to become trained as artists. This goes back to his days at the Académie Julian, where there were classes specifically for women and where Tony Robert Fleury, one of his main teachers, was responsible for the instruction of a lot of modern women coming to Paris to study art. And Corinth opens a studio and opens a school for women to come and learn to paint under his instruction. Here's a photograph from about 1902 of the class that he has assembled. You see him seated there at the lower right, and just above him, her dark hair falling into her face, is a young woman named Charlotte Berendt. Charlotte Berendt becomes his great muse. They fall in love, and by 1902, they are living together and traveling together. He paints this extraordinarily beautiful portrait of her in the City Museum in Berlin. And in 1902, they travel to the seashore. He paints her in her bare feet, paddling in the water. They had their photograph taken. And later in 1902, he paints her seated in his lap in homage to Rembrandt, with his great image of himself with Saskia, his wife. And she must have been, by all accounts, she is an incredibly engaging, lovely woman with a mischievous eye, she delights in participating in his dress-up games. Here she is, seen from behind, very much as his model and muse in this self-portrait with the model from 1903. And here, standing in front of one of his crucifixions at about the same time. And here in 1908, participating in a bacchanal, and they seem to very much enjoy their food and drink. But not so much, and also here I'm certain that she is the model at the far right, though perhaps not at the far left. And in these beautiful studies of her bathing, dressing after a bath, these wonderful sort of impressionist studies, which make me think that he must have had caught sight of works by Pierre-Auguste Renoir. By 1909, when he paints this portrait of the family, they have, in fact, a son and a daughter. The son, Thomas, is born in 1903, after their marriage in the spring of that year. And their daughter, Wilhelmina, is born in 1909, and she's a baby when she's portrayed in this picture here. They travel all over Europe. He paints her again and again. and she becomes really the most joyful subject of his art. He dedicates a still life to her. He paints her waking up in the morning. He paints her over a still life of flowers, fruit, and game. But in 1911, in December of 1911, he suffers a stroke. He recovers fairly quickly, and this painting and drawing from 1912 show that he has begun to get his ability to paint and draw back. But there, as you can see, there's something very slightly odd about the set of his eyes. He is, however, that summer able to paint something as beautiful as this view of her standing on the balcony at Bordighera. And whether or not he used his left or right hand after his stroke is still a matter of some debate amongst scholars. He, however, definitely loosens up his style at this moment. Between the still life that you see of 1911 at the left and the still life of 1912 at the right, there is a loosening of the facture of the brushwork and of the application of paint in the paintings. And for instance, between this painting of 1911 at the left and the one of 1912 at the right, you see a similar change. But we also have to remember that art is changing around Corinth at this time. And in 1911 and 12, over that year, a group of artists in Munich are showing with Heinrich Tannhäuser at his gallery with their group that they are calling the Blue Rider, Der Blaue Reiter, with Heinrich Tannhäuser, as I said. And they include works like this one by Franz Marc, or works by Wassily Kandinsky. So the world of art is changing. And in Berlin, at the same time, at the Gurlitt Gallery, he's seeing the works of the artists who call themselves Die Brücke, the bridge, Pechstein, or Kirchner. So his art begins to change as well. And I think you have seen him go from a kind of astonishing academic style in the 1880s and 1890s to full-blown impressionism in some of his flower pieces or the pictures of his wife bathing, to here in 1912 what can only be classified as a kind of nascent expressionism in his Blinded Samson. His watercolors of this period are also extraordinarily powerful and loose and look very much like the watercolors of a fully expressionist artist like Emil Nolde, like this one from 1913. Now, then in 1914, after he has recovered from his stroke for a couple of years, in the summer of 1914, in August of 1914, the First World War begins. Wilhelm II, the militaristic and saber-rattling Emperor of Germany, is widely regarded as the catalyst for the war, even though the assassination of a Viennese or Austrian Archduke was the pretext. And during this period, Corinth continues to live in Berlin, and he is extraordinarily patriotic. He, like many, many Germans of his time period, believes in the cause of Germany and does not see the war as we now, in retrospect, see it as being the fault of the Germans. And he dons that suit of armor, as he has already done a couple of times before, and paints a portrait of himself in 1914, standing proudly in his studio, very much as a proud and patriotic German. Over the course of the next 4 years, however, things become a little bit more equivocal, and there can be no denying that the situation in Germany perhaps less dire than it is in France or Belgium, is still nonetheless very, very bad. And so we find that skeleton coming out again, and this time taking the foreground in this etching of, I believe, 1917 or 18. The sense of the presence of the war becomes a bit more pessimistic and menacing in his art, where he's painting again with the suit of armor, painting a model in a picture that sort of has to do with the defense of Germany against the attacks of the Allies, or a portrait of a friend in his uniform where, although he is simply wearing a cap, it looks as if his head is wearing a bloodied bandage from 1914. And he paints in 1917 an extraordinary picture called Cain, in which we see Cain killing Abel as ravens attack from above, a gigantic picture, as you can see from the photograph at the right, where you see Corinth in front of the painting in his studio, and one in which the expressionist style is fully in place. 1918 comes, and with it the defeat of Germany, and the suit of armor that he has worn so proudly in 1914 collapses. Here's a painting that, as you will remember if you've been upstairs, is in Modern Art and Politics in Germany, our exhibition, from the Neue Nationalgalerie in Germany, this collapsed suit of armor painted in 1918. So what is an artist, a patriotic artist, to do in the aftermath of war? One of the things that he does is to continue working. And he is delighted, I feel sure, to receive a visit from Heinrich Tannhauser, who in December of 1918, in the weeks after the armistice, comes to Berlin and has himself painted by Lovis Corinth. Tannhauser had already been painted by Max Oppenheim and by Max Liebermann, but I think there's no contesting the fact that the portrait by Lovis Corinth is the best of the group. It announces for me a new direction in Corinth's portrait painting, which had already been one of his great talents, from 1888 when he paints his father, to the 1890s when he paints a cousin. 1901 paints the family of an artist friend, his daughter and her aunt in 1919, and will continue on in 1924 with this portrait of Charlotte at the right and Thomas, again wearing that suit of armor, the young son who by now is in his 20s, who is being painted in the suit of armor in 1924. 25, excuse me. He can continue to paint still lives, and does. Here's the one that I showed you earlier from 1911. Another from 1913. This one from the middle of the war years. This one from slightly later. And this one from 1920. He paints landscapes, as he has done since the 1880s and 90s, whether in an impressionist manner or in a new expressionist mode. A seascape here, a view of winter, or a view of the lake where he loved to paint so much, and where he painted many, many landscapes in the 19 teens and 20s. His mastery of the nude extends all the way to the end of his career, from the 1880s, this one about 1890, this one from 1907, slightly later, I think 1910 or 11, 1921, and these extraordinary nudes of Venus rising from the sea at left and Susanna and the Elders at right, from the last years of his career, around 1922, 23, 24. And this extraordinary piece, again, I think he must have seen Cézanne, but he could also have been thinking of Rubens equally when he paints this extraordinary Bacchanal in the last year of his life. The history paintings that he began making in his early career with such works as the Deposition from 1895 extend to just after the turn of the century and all the way into the 1920s with this extraordinary Crucifixion from 1922. And this amazing Ecce Homo painted in 1925. Based on that watercolor from 1913 that I showed you a moment ago. He says, I'm about to start a large picture. It will be an Ecce Homo. I am going to complete it, for the Easter time has increased my energy. As an artist, I feel a profound affinity for the events of the Bible and its feast days. And in the image of Christ between Pilate and a guard, modeled by his friends, he's able to produce one of the great German expressionist paintings of all time. So, this is Lovis Corinth, a man who, across a period of, we've looked at, across a period of about 40 years, changes the way that he paints, changes his subject matter, but has consistency within his artistic vision, moving ever more boldly into a expressive and I would say modern and adventuresome way of painting. Always brave from the beginning of his career, but as the time goes forward, moving into bolder and bolder ways of expressing himself. And in the graphic arts, whether in lithography or etching or in amazing drawings, he studies himself again and again. A constant ambition to achieve a goal I never reached has made my life bitter, he writes again towards the end of his life. And each piece of work ended in depression when I thought of having to continue this life. To be sure, whenever I compared my work with that of others, it seemed to me that I was good as or better than anyone else. Lieberman once told me that one must have everything to discover how unimportant everything is. For my part, however, I am sickened by everything. I don't even want to have what I still could achieve because it disgusts me already. Perhaps it is the sad state of Germany today that bears responsibility for this disgust. The times for us old ones have changed so much. It's wretched, most sad, very sad, and the future is hidden by the darkest curtain. He writes this in 1923-24, just as he's painting a painting like this one, amongst the last of his self-portraits, maybe the very last of his self-portrait, now at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And he dies in 1925. And he dies in a world that, in a Berlin that is unlike the city he had moved to 25 years before. It's a place where, in the Weimar Republic, with the empire gone, it's a new city, it's a new world, it's a modern world, and perhaps, as he says, for us old-timers, the world has changed too much. It's the world in which Christian Schad can paint Sonia out at a nightclub, where George Grosz can paint the pillars of society in a biting satire on the political, social, and moral ethics of the time. Where Heinrich Tannhauser and Alfred Fleckheim, as painted by him, Lovis Corinth, and Otto Dix, are showing the work of modern artists like Picasso or Kandinsky, or Emil Nolde, where Emil Nolde's work is being bought for the National Gallery in this one in 1929, I believe, where modern art is on display and very much being celebrated at the annex of the Nationalgalerie in the Crown Prince's Palace on Unter den Linden. But where in 1933, Adolf Hitler is sworn in as Chancellor of Germany. From that point on, and remember, Corinth is now dead, from that point on, the Germany in which Corinth lived begins to change radically. And his art and his reputation becomes affected by that. The ambition of Ludwig Giusti, the man who you see at the left, who is the director of the Nationalgalerie, the ambition that he has for showing the art of the present, the art of living Germany, is derided. And in comes a man named Adolf Ziegler. He's a painter, and he has painted what is Hitler's favorite painting, this extraordinary, rather horrifying, but still kind of horrifying like a snake is mesmerizing, this picture of the four seasons, the four elements, a painting that hung in Hitler's office in the Chancellery. Ziegler is taxed by Hitler with creating or with purging the German museums of degenerate art. And hundreds of thousands of paintings and prints and drawings are seized from museums all over Germany. From the National Gallery in Berlin, 500 paintings and sculptures are removed, including all of these works by Lovis Corinth. And many of them are put on view in the exhibition Degenerate Art, which opens in July of 1937 in Munich, where they are there simply to be laughed at and spat upon by the public. There's the Nolde that you see in the exhibition up at the upper left. And there in the middle is Lovis Corinth's Ecce Homo. So the most valuable of these works of art that were seized from the museums were taken to a collecting point where they were evaluated for sale abroad. Lists were typed up. Here's the list of the works by Corinth taken from the National Gallery. This is the copy of this list, the only copy of this list that is to be found now at the Victoria and Albert Museum, where everything is written down, its disposition given in a column, what it made eventually. This all typed up after the sales had been completed. And in Lucerne at the Gallery Fischer in 1939, a group of works is sold, including many by Lovis Corinth. Here in the catalog, arranged alphabetically, at the top you have got Chagall and the bottom Corinth, a still life, another 4 works of which 2 are illustrated, a self-portrait that's had been in the National Gallery, and a landscape below, a picture of a child at the top, and that beautiful still life with a girl at the bottom, another still life, and a eccentric portrait. And these are sold at auction by Fisher, but at the same time, other works are being sold independently, not going to auction, but being sold straight from the museums through dealers to collectors and, in fact, to other institutions outside Germany. And one of those institutions is directed by the man in the shiny coat here in the center. His name is Georg Schmidt, and he is the newly appointed director of the Kunstmuseum in Basel in Switzerland, not very far at all from Germany, very close to the German border, far from Berlin, but and not very far from Lucerne, where the auction is going to take place. But he enters into discussion with 2 separate dealers in Berlin, both of whom are offering him works of art that he can buy independent of the auction route. For his new museum, which has just opened a few years before. It opened, I think, in 1936, and we're dealing here with 1939. A big museum. It had a distinguished collection of older paintings, but it was lacking in a great collection of modern art, which happens to be now its greatest feature. And amongst the paintings that he targeted for acquisition, which was not sold at auction, was the great Ecce Homo by Lovis Corinth. It was, in fact, bought for that museum, where it hangs now. Almost 20 paintings, I think, were acquired either by private sale or by auction by the Kunstmuseum in Basel, with the defense or argument that they were, in fact, and I think they were right, saving these works of art for posterity by taking them from one museum or several museums in Germany and installing them in another museum in Switzerland, where they felt that they would be safe. And indeed they are. Here is my colleague and friend, Eva Reifert, who has installed an exhibition a couple of years ago about this process of the acquisition of modern art for the museum in Basel, with the two of the paintings by Lovis Corinth that were acquired for the museum in the 1930s, all in 1939. Lovis Corinth's name lives on in strange ways. Literally this morning, I discovered that there is such a thing as the Lovis Corinth Colloquium, held every year for the past 20 years at Emory University in Atlanta, made possible by a bequest from Corinth's daughter-in-law, a woman who was born and grew up in Oklahoma, who married Thomas Corinth in New York, who moved to Georgia towards the end of her life, and left money to Emory University especially for the purpose of holding a scholarly colloquium every year for the study of art, modern art, and German and Northern Renaissance art. And every year, Lovis Corinth's name gets brought up at Emory University with a great group of speakers. This year, marking the 100th anniversary of his death, the National Gallery, the Nationalgalerie, the Alte Nationalgalerie in Berlin, will hold an exhibition about Lovis Corinth, the Nationalgalerie, and the Degenerate Art Campaign, which will touch on some of the topics I just discussed. and that will be held at the Alte Nationalgalerie, the place to which an artist like Corinth could aspire when he moved to Berlin in 1900. But without Lovis Corinth, I think we can argue that certain kinds of art never would have come to being. We need to remember him not just through a symposium or an exhibition, but we need to see that Lovis Corinth's art exists in his inheritance, in his heritage. Without Lovis Corinth, it would be hard to imagine the early works of Max Beckmann or Beckmann's great series of self-portraits, which so closely parallels Corinth's series of self-portraits done between the 1890s and the 1920s. Imagine also the relationship between Lovis Corinth and an artist like Francis Bacon, who is said to have admired him very much. Or Georg Baselitz, the great German contemporary painter who owes a lot to German Expressionism, and I would say particularly to Lovis Corinth. Lucian Freud, who you remember comes from Austria to begin with, from a Germanic background, certainly appreciates or appreciated Lovis Corinth in such works as his Lee Bowery from the 1990s, or Jenny Saville with her painting from 1999, shown here. And perhaps even an artist like Anselm Kiefer, who in his expressionistic engagement with the natural world could look back to the works of Lovis Corinth. So I hope that through this sort of walk through some ideas around this artist, that you will have come to a new and perhaps even a first appreciation of this still little-known artist who I think is one of the great unsung heroes of modern art. An artist who I think deserves a lot more of our attention, and which I hope you will give more attention to, perhaps during the last weeks of modern art and politics in Germany, but also whenever you see a painting by this extraordinary artist again in the future. And I thank you very much for your attention.